Hello and most welcome to 1328, and I will continue today with what I started with 2 lectures ago in 1326. That is affordances and the connective powers. Just give me a second. And I was into law-based versus convention-based use of lawful ecological information. The practical upshot of all this is that there is therefore room to learn to use information to mean something other than what it specifies. Golonka 2015 characterized the possibilities for using lawful ecological information into 2 categories. Law-based use and convention-based use. The law-based use of lawful ecological information is when an organism uses that variable as perceptual information. For the dynamical property that created it and organizes its behavior with respect to that property. The convention-based use of information is when an organism uses that variable as perceptual information. For anything other than the dynamical property that created it. So as to organize its behavior with respect to an evolutionary, experimentally ecologically or socioculturally maintained convention, linking the property to something else. the kind of constraints invoked by Breunenberg et al. Linking the property to something else. That connection is very important. The kind of constraints invoked by Breunenberg et al. As general ecological information. Will not able to function as perceptual information are the kind of constraints that make convention-based use of lawful information an option. Law-based use and convention-based use does not break down clearly along obvious lines such as natural versus human-made, social versus non-social, or linguistic versus non-linguistics, linguistic. Therefore, it is necessary to take a task-specific approach to deciding whether a behavior is organized. With respect to conventional or law-based information. That task-specific approach proceeds as follows. The ecological information available to an organism is created by the lawful projection of task dynamics into array kinematics. Using lawful ecological information in a law-based manner means using a variable as information for the dynamical property that created it. E.g., detecting information created by a beer can and using that information to organize your reaching and grasping behavior so that it complements the beer can's grasping affordances. The law-based use of information can support both action selection, coordination, and action control. Because the variable is being used as information for the action relevant task property that we need to behave with respect to. For example, law-based use supports both selecting prehension of that beer can as an appropriate action, as well as the online control of that prehension, because it entails using the variable as information for prehension relevant properties of the can. Using information in a convention-based manner means using a variable as information for something other than the dynamical property that created it, e.g., detecting information created by the beer can and using that information to organize your behavior with respect to the presence of beer. The convention-based use of information can only support action selection because the variable is not being used as information for that action relevant task property. The convention-based use of beer can information only supports selecting, picking that beer can rather than a soup can when I want beer. Because it entails using the information as informations for the presence of beer rather than the beer can's graspability. despite the differences in the behaviors they can support, these users are not different in kind. In both cases, the organism detects an information pattern and learns to use it to support some behavior, and that works to the extent the relevant constraint between information and world properties and that or relations support that behavior. In addition, all kinds of animals can use information with respect to many kinds of conventions. Humans can use it with respect to complex socio-cultural or linguistic conventions. But even bees can learn to select a path based on the color of a piece of card. And the experimenter imposed convention about which color means which path. Convention-based use of information is therefore not a uniquely human ability, nor an intrinsically linguistic one. Quite the contrary. Convention-based use of information seems to not just be an option, but a common one. Conclusion. In order to be psychologically interesting, affordances must be perceptible. In order to be perceptible, they must come into perceptual informational contact with an organism. Ecological information must take the form of specifying structures in the relatively low energy media that are ambient to the organism, because these are the only things that fill the literal gap between the organism and its task environment. And to do so in a way that supports direct perception of affordances. General ecological information does not take this form. Instead, it's merely a regularity between dynamical properties. General ecological information does not take this form. Instead, it is merely a regularity between dynamical properties and not between those properties and an organism. It can therefore not be informative to an organism, and we therefore cannot perceive affordances as relations that rely on it. Affordances as relations are a seductive idea because they seem to offer a solution to the big question of how we are able to organize our behavior with respect to things other than the physical properties of objects in our immediate surroundings. Without representing those distant things. But they cannot be perceived, and therefore they are not the ecological solution we have been looking for. All behavior begins when an organism detects lawfully created ecological information, and the behavior that develops is structured by the form of that information. This is where our explanations for any behavior must begin, and the work of information use that lives firmly within the affordances as disposition ontology seems like a better place to start. Affordances, I have to say, as a conclusion, takes a lot of time to get into. It's a incredibly different way of looking at the world. Very hard to find anything similar to it. There are some parallels to Wittgensteinian thinking, and you can get the smell of Dasein there somewhere. But in reality, the perspective is wholly different. I like the idea this was forced to the surface by the discoveries in practical science with J. Gibson. Thinking and practice hand in hand led to the conclusion of the necessity of affordances. It would not have happened within the philosophical sphere alone. No chance. We'll put a little note and we can continue with the next one. Second, put a little break here maybe. We will continue with fractal geometry as a bridge between realms by Terry Marks-Tarlow, very interesting author. It's somewhat similar to the previous project, but there are differences indeed. I'm at the 30th page and there will be a link so you can download the article. It's free for read. At least if you go to ResearchGate. Could be a recommendation here. Some will charge, but you will find others where you're not being charged. There are others as well where you need to be a member of some sort. We just coming to how René Descartes' method of analytic geometry gave humankind an even sharper, downright three-dimensional view of distinctions in the natural world. I will read one sentence that I read before in 1324. The simultaneous invention of perspective in art plus René Descartes' method of analytic geometry gave humankind an even sharper, downright three-dimensional view of distinctions in the natural world. During this third stage, human beings stopped projecting the contents of inner processes into the outer world. Or at least, this is what they believed they were doing. Beginning with the Renaissance, all attention became fixated on how to categorize perceptible objects. How very true. The world of appearances became privileged over that of the imagination, and tools of science and math aided in this mission of objectifying perception. And I think this should be put in perspective with Ian McGilchrist, the master and his emissary, where in pre-Socratic time of the Iliad and the Odyssey, we began to put object and started with a definite article, and verbs became less inhabited and more things came to the object side, seemed to be stuck in the object side. And this is close to objectifying perception. With everyone acting as if observers could be separated from processes of their observation. This period of collective consciousness accompanied the development of classical science, while anticipating the emergence of first-order cybernetics. The fourth and current stage of self-reflexive consciousness arose during the 19th century, when previous seeds of recursion became concretely embedded into mathematical technique. George Cantor's introduction of the pigeonhole technique, by which numbers are paired one-to-one with subsets of themselves, brought recognition of multiple sizes of infinity. Eventually, the number of infinities proliferated until an infinite variety was unveiled. At the same time that conscious understanding of recursion became ever more deeply embedded in abstract systems of symbolization. Human consciousness was beginning to circle back around to conceptualize imaginative basis for its own unconscious processing. This is evident in the work of South American psychologist Ignacio Mateblanco, who uses the seeming illogic of infinite sets to characterize the nature of unconscious thinking. See Mattoblanco and Rayner, 1998. The hallmark of infinite sets is apparent psychologically whenever we generalize a single encounter to every case. This occurs, for example, in the immature psyche of young children fond of calling all women mummy. It also occurs in the immature psyche of adults guilty of stereotyping, racial bias, or misogyny. By contrast, Mateblanco claims that consciousness of everyday distinctions rests on the mathematics of finite sets. Here, thinking is tethered to deductive methods of concrete discovery. Objects either exist or do not, as deduced by minute-to-minute experience. And guided by Boolean and Aristotelian logic, devoid of wild inductive leaps. Mateblanco's brand of virtual logic, inspired by properties of infinite sets, objects either exist or do not, as deduced by minute-to-minute experience and guided by Boolean and Aristotelian logic, devoid of wild inductive leaps. She is a marvel of a writer indeed. This is the clearest expounding I heard of this exact thing before. Mate Blanco's brand of virtual logic, inspired by properties of infinite sets, anticipates this author's intrapsychic interpretation of fractal dynamics. As mathematically defined, fractals are partially infinite and partially finite. While the Euclidean dimension anchors and bounds them in the real world, they also partake of the infinite, which is necessary to calculate fractional dimensionality. As elaborated upon shortly, fractals occupy a twilight existence between real and idealized dimensions. Here the symmetry of identity, self-similarity, paradoxically exhibits parts as complex and infinitely detailed as their whole. Observers observing themselves, imaginary numbers and hidden dimensions. The shortest path between two truths in the real domain passes through the complex domain. Jacques Hadamard. By self-reflexively using numbers to code and reflect upon other numbers, Austrian mathematician Gödel brought this fourth stage of human self-reflexive consciousness to full fruition. In the mid-20th century, enter second-order cybernetics plus symbol makers using symbols to symbolize the symbolizing process itself plus inherent limitations therein. like an eyeball attempting to twist around to view its own mechanism. Gödel's mathematics plus the cybernetics of cybernetics. Make obvious that no observer can ever hope to observe the observation process fully. Without either receiving an incomplete view or becoming mired in a paradox. Figure 4 illustrates how paradoxes of self-reference appear in the work of two different artists. The left frame portrays the author's rendition of Maurice Escher's famous drawing The Art Gallery. An observer looks at a picture of a gallery that includes the observer himself. The perspective is continuous. As it wraps from outside towards inside of the observer. Yet a point of discontinuity remains in the form of a blank spot in the center. The blank spot indicates a singularity forming where all order breaks down and the image dissolves recursively into internal contradiction. The right-hand frame, inspired by a David Hockney drawing, portrays self-reference as a canvas within a canvas, implying a discontinuous relationship between external observation and the embedded nature of the self as observer. In a second here. The right-hand frame, inspired by a David Hockney drawing, implying a discontinuous relationship between external observation and the embedded nature of the self as a observer. Just as a different picture on the lens can emerge with the next blink of an eye, this form of discrete representation displays crisp edges between embedded levels. While I won't claim that fractals represent a symbol at the same level that 0 and infinity do, I will assert that a system of notation ushered in by fractal geometry represents a portmanteau embodying infinite finite, continuous and discontinuous methods of symbolization. Here, recursive iteration on the imaginary plane reveals yet another level of complexity, both in nature and collective consciousness. Here, observers are even more complexly self-reflexively and consciously entangled in the observed. This fleshes out further Jung's intuition that number brings order into the chaos of appearances. Within fractals, not only does what you see depend upon the scale of observation, this fleshes out further Jung's intuition that number brings order into the chaos of appearances. Within fractals, not only does what you see depend upon the scale of observation, but also the closer you look, the more there is to see. As a prelude to fractals, let's consider imaginary numbers, which appear as a vital link between complicated order manifest in nature and in the human mind. Discovered in the 17th century by Italian mathematician Jerome Cardano, imaginary numbers involve two independent or orthogonal axes. One real and one imaginary, and the seemingly impossible square root of -0. As their name suggests, these numbers originally were considered entirely fanciful, even though they kept cropping up in equations of the form x squared equals -1. As often occurs with even the most far out seeming mathematical abstractions, unexpected practical uses are eventually found, sometimes in the strangest, most apparently magical places. For example, although non-Euclidean geometry was originally thought impractical and contradictory to everyday perception, its rather strange geometry perfectly models Einstein's four-dimensional curvature of space-time. Generally, within mathematical equations, the square root of -1 represents invisible, extra, or hidden dimensionality. In electrical engineering, it models reversed polarities of alternating currents. In Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, The square root of -1 represents the fourth dimension of time added to the three customary dimensions of space: length, width, and depth. As modeled geometrically by Kaufman 2001, imaginary numbers also crop up in quantum mechanics. Another field spawned by Einstein's discoveries, where they capture or fail to capture immeasurable, non-local aspects of electron behavior known as wave functions. Jung and his followers play with the idea that imaginary numbers serve to unify inner and outer worlds. As Robertson 2000 notes, Jung mistakenly calls them transcendent numbers and names a corresponding psychological function, the transcendent function, after them. Jung interprets real and imaginary aspects of the complex plane in terms of the union of conscious and unconscious contents of the psyche. This union for Jung constitutes the essence of individuation, the process by which we come most fully into ourselves. During individuation, the little self of the conscious ego aligns and balances with the big self of the unconscious whole. The part of the known coincides with the whole of the unknown. Physicist and psychologist Arnold Mindell believes that all mathematics is a code for linking observers with the observed. Mindell upholds imaginary numbers to represent qualitative, subjective aspects of experience. or what he calls non-consensual reality. His thinking influenced by Wolfgang Pauli. A physicist whose psychoanalysis also inspired Jung. Pauli's most famous dream involved an inner music teacher who conceptualized imaginary numbers as the key to unifying physics and psychology. Geometrically, by signifying a phase shift of 90 degrees in the complex plane to represent orthogonal dimensions. Kaufman 2001 characterizes I, which is the root of -1, as the most primal distinction in the observer. Generally, it appears that those artificially constructed fictions called complex numbers, which possesses both a real and an imaginary component, tended to emerge in the very same self-reflexive places where the observer is increasingly detectable within the observed. Fractal geometry. Quote from Homer Smith from Computer Engineer Art Matrix. If you like fractals, it is because you are made of them. If you can't stand fractals, it is because you can't stand yourself. It happens. Fractal geometry represents the full mathematical fruition of the fourth stage of self-reflexive consciousness, where imaginary numbers are concretized in nature simultaneously to co-create world and self. Computer-generated fractals provide one of the most successful tools ever discovered, invented for simulating highly complex forms in nature. With fractals comes the semiotic recognition of how the infinite becomes finitely embodied in nature. When the computer is used as a microscope on the complex plane to zoom in on ever smaller scales of the nonlinear Mandelbrot set, iteration exhibits unceasing complexity, shifting dynamically with the perspective of the observer. This is illustrated in the Mandelbrot zoom with figure 5, where each box represents a magnification of a small area within the previous box. The benchmark of fractals is self-similarity, a newly discovered self-reflexive symmetry in which parts of the fractal object resemble the whole. Sometimes this resemblance is approximate and statistical, as in the case with a nonlinear Mandelbrot set. Other times self-similarity is exact, such as with linear fractals. Figure 6 illustrates a linear fractal called the Koch snowflake. In this figure, we easily see how each iteration brings greater complexity. While the area within the snowflake remains finitely bounded, the edges of the Koch curve grew infinitely complex. Whether we consider the linear or nonlinear variety of fractal, not only is the whole greater than the sum of its parts, the hallmark of organic as compared to purely mechanistic systems, but the whole is also paradoxically embodied within the very parts themselves. Everywhere they arise, fractals occupy the boundary zone between dynamic open processes in nature. This quality of betweenness is illuminated by a technical understanding of fractal dimensionality. Since imaginary numbers model hidden dimensionality, in the case of fractals, this consists of infinite expanses or imaginary frontiers that lurk in the spaces between ordinary Euclidean dimensions. I think this could be a good place to make a sort of a summary. To see. As you can see here with fractality, we go in quite another direction. We look more steadily towards the distinction observer and observed being blurred, exactly almost to the point as what we spoke about when it came to affordances. It's a blurring out of the distinctions. And in affordances we learned it is very hard to say, except for a very, very few cases, what is observer and what is observed. Within each thing, the meaning lies in the thing itself. It is not something projected by the subject. To be compared with the ideas of Kant, who says the subject puts the distinctions into an outer world, and that is very easily defined according to Kant. And also the two aspects that we usually talk about with all the philosophers before Newton. Hume, good example, seemed to be a misunderstanding that there is a clear distinction between observer and observed. In fractality, this is even clearer. We are submerged in reality, not easily taken out of the picture, because what is objective stems from the interaction with whatever the other thing is. It's intertwined. And this is the only way of making anything have the aspect of being real. Especially interesting is in the video clip which I can recommend dearly, by Terry Marks-Tarlow on the YouTube, where you see exactly where you put in the understanding in a fractality, a Mandelbrot set, that will change what is on the screen. This is the two-slit experiment, where the observer changes, and all ideas of an isolated observer makes all understanding impossible, I would say. It becomes a joke. Someone said, how can I first observe something without being there and then be there? You need to make your reality fractal to understand that. There is no understanding per se. Understanding has shape, form, smell, tones, intentions, directions, emotions. All these are part of the understanding. And the very idea you can just go to a text and you understand it from nowhere. We have shown in this lecture series so many times that the Thomas Nagel perspective from nowhere doesn't hold. It doesn't hold when you do the things, when you're becoming practical. It only holds in an emotional, subjective, non-usable, non-real way. I would say the idea of an isolated observer doesn't have an idea behind it. It's just a way of not of understanding. And that misunderstanding is different from each one of us. It's not a similar misunderstanding. It doesn't have similar traits. Reductionism is not a thing at all. It is not understanding to a certain part. It is blocking out some knowing and accepting some other, but on an absolutely random base, which makes generalization impossible, I would say. Adding fractality and affordances is very hard, but it is always beneficial. You don't accept affordances or fractality because they are fun theories. You start to get into them, practice them, and they will help you. There is no understanding to be lost here. You're not replacing one ideology with another one. This goes into the thinking, modus, attention you already have and makes it more stable, broader, open or encompassing, without you having to go into compromising your thinking or trying to change the content like Bertrand Russell did 58 times or something like that. We are talking about form and content at the same time. And this is very similar to the project of Roberto Mangabeira, Unger and Lee Smolin, showing that if you bring the landscape into the picture, not ignoring it or sending it far away, you will gain so much more calculative and understanding wise. You will start to understand the why question. So of course Heidegger is lurking about. This is the way to avoid question. This is to how understand you don't have to make do with what and where, which is the Heisenbergian indeterminacy. And you don't have to fall into the trap as much, or not at all, as poor Gödel, who demanded what he thought to be consistency and coherency in mathematics, a most definite limitation on reality for him only. I usually take up the example, the conference in Paris of 1900, but I do need to point out they were not sharing a common view of reality. They were equally confused, but all in their different ways. There is no specific understanding in this Newtonian paradigm. It is not approximately true on the macro scale, because there is where the problem starts. They do not start in the microwave, I would say, into microwave. We become more distinct and sharp if we understand that the border between the two poles that we usually define as subjective and objective is a focusing length, and we need to be able to change the lens, to put in different things, different focal settings. Otherwise we will understand less, because all the world is a fractality. Do look into that animation of Terry in her video. There will be a link to it in the description of this video. I think I've never seen such an animation so clearly depicting, oh, here comes the observer, and he's both into the whole, what we usually call objective, and of an outer. And I would say this is a snatch better than the Klein bottle even. Well, this was interesting. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now. And here the 1st of January, the first recording of 2023. It's already dark by 5 o'clock. Thank you.